Hello, welcome back to week number 5. I am Ian Price.
And I'm Steve, and we're live again. Well, recorded, but,
We're still alive, barely.
I hope.
So, this week, we promised you surveillance tech and story structures.
Jinx.
I already got you a Coke.
Okay. So where do we start?
This is my Coke. We start with surveillance equipment.
All right, we'll start with surveillance equipment.
Like the Coke we're drinking. It's got nanomachines.
Nanomachines
well,
are...
probably not. And the Coke you're drinking in Downbelow probably also doesn't have nanomachines in it, unless you've really pissed off somebody with a lot of resources, and then it could.
But the thing is, in that case, they'd have to work really hard to get the nanomachines into the Coke that you're guaranteed to drink. And long story short, unless you pissed off someone who is both rich, creative, and bored, it's highly unlikely that you have to worry that much about drinking canned beverages, because there's a lot of work to ensure that something that you've purchased from a store... Basically, we're into major conspiracy theory territory. And major conspiracy theory territory is actually why the fact that though there's a pervasive surveillance state in Nuevo Paradiso, it's not actually all that bad for people up to no good and or illicit activities.
Because the surveillance is blanket surveillance, and when you've got a pattern, people are really good at figuring out patterns, and so you can find ways around the pattern.
That plus, okay. So, first, obviously, there are places where there are no surveillance systems. For whatever reason, surveillance is wonky there. Often
For example, on those portions of the island that are not particularly livable that we mentioned, they don't bother to have much in the way of surveillance because they haven't built much of anything.
They will usually have physical surveillance, by which I mean a pair or more of eyes mounted on a human being, or, I'm not going into the cyber horror side of things. That's generally not a down-below core thing for Nuevo Paradiso. Ask me about some of the other places sometime. But,
Nuevo Paradiso does not go into cyborg rats as a surveillance system.
No, there are other places that do. And there are places that, because...
China, for example.
Usually because they are nationalized, there are places that actually do have even tighter surveillance and even tighter security.
China, for example.
Where China is, yeah, don't say anything bad about China, they will know. And those rich, bored people...
If not because of the rats, they'll know because your friends will report you on the social network. Oh wait, that's real life.
Exactly. And that ties in very well too. So let's cover the basics of surveillance and the basis of security in Nuevo Paradiso really quickly. Basics of surveillance number 1. The fact is, most of the security on Nuevo Paradiso is geared towards protecting the corporate interests of Yggdrasil Corporation. That's the whole reason that the island exists in the first place. That's the whole basis of their extraterritoriality. That's the whole basis of why people from all over the globe flock there specifically to fall through the cracks. Most of the security is based around just making sure that nobody tampers with Yggdrasil or the people who are dealing with them. You want to kill somebody, as long as that person is not an Yggdrasil employee, not connected to an Yggdrasil subsidiary or contractor, and the body is not going to get in the way of moving gear, people aren't going to care as much. They might even have video of you doing it. And it's
but
going to
unless somebody complains, then they're not going to do much. The Yggdrasil security forces, who are the main security force on the island, aren't going to do very much. And even if somebody does complain, they're just going to try to turn you over to whatever embassy they can fob you off on.
Exactly. And for various reasons, and they're not likely to do that because the embassies don't want to process people because that's a lot of work. And
like I said, unless somebody complains.
Pretty much.
So they might even find the body, have video of you doing it, but not have a great, huge incentive to find you. Now, speaking of video of you doing it, there's 2 ways they'd have video of you doing it. One of these ways, they would take care of you for it. The other of these ways, well, it's about who complains.
Right.
So, way number 1, did you do it on Yggdrasil property where they actually have built explicit surveillance systems that they have people constantly monitoring to make sure that their property is protected and that they know what's going on with it? They have several different layers. All the senses are covered. Indeed, spectrums that human senses normally don't cover are covered. And then there's the rest of the island. And the primary concept that is employed on the rest of the island, except where private business owners have installed their own explicit security systems, is actually crowdsourced surveillance. This is something which, in the real world, is highly controversial these days because it involves things like getting access to the video feeds from everybody's cell phones. And in real-world countries, a lot of real-world countries like America and Britain, there's a huge controversy over whether the government should be allowed to do that.
If you remember back to the second of the Christopher Nolan Batman films, that was actually a major ethical controversy at the end that led Alfred to consider, not Alfred, I'm sorry, Lucius Fox, Morgan Freeman's character, to basically abandon his support, well, his direct support of the Batman vigilante. I don't think it led him to quit Wayne Enterprises, but it really changed the dynamic between the Batman and his support figures. It was big. It was central to the idea that Batman was operating so far outside the law that he was doing things that were unethical even for governments to consider.
And on Nuevo Paradiso, it is de rigueur for their security forces. Your data is going through their cell routing.
Yep.
They use it. They use all of that, but there's way too much of it for people to sort. So what they have is they have artificial intelligences that have been trained to sort for criminal and other of potential disturbance to public safety information in that massive pile of information. And they prioritize them for security forces.
If you're using this in a game, there are functionally only two reasons you would be using this. And we're going to talk briefly about the first reason, and then we're going to talk more in depth about the second. The first reason that you would be using this is that you are looking for someone yourself. If you're looking for someone yourself, the way to use it is very simple. First, it'll cost a certain number of successes from your pool, however you obtain them. Maybe you obtain them by using your
Maybe you got a
fast
friend
talk.
in the security service, and you use the friend trait plus your fast talk, like you said.
Maybe you are going to try to fast talk a guard that you have no tie to, and it'll take more successes, but you can do that. Maybe you have a way inside the AIs to search for that data yourself. But it's incredibly simple to use that to get there. Now that brings me to the second one, avoiding surveillance. This is the reason that it takes a lot of successes to use the surveillance, though, because pretty much anyone who survives more than a couple of days and rises to anywhere but the level of common street thug in the Downbelow hierarchy, anyone who is planning to move and shake quickly learns a couple of ways around security.
If you're doing something that can be done in an abandoned back alley, then it pretty much takes one success to ensure that nobody in that back alley has a phone running so that you can get something done on the down low.
Methodology. Way number one, unplug. If you do not have electronic surveillance equipment with you, they cannot use eyes and ears from that surveillance equipment to track you.
So if your cell phone's battery is pulled out and all the other people in the back alley have it pulled out, and you've swept to make sure that there's no random passers-by in this alley.
Frankly, it also makes a lot of sense to have someone along with you so you can literally just give them the cell phone and not worry about other things that might be running on backup. Batteries are weird. Sometimes conspiracy theorists might be right.
But if you physically take all the cell phones from the group and give them to your lookout to have by the mouth of the alley, then they're not recording what's going on in the alley.
Yep. And especially if the lookout just makes sure he rattles the bag a lot, so they can't even pick up stuff that might be happening out there. That also brings up an interesting point. In the hyper-technological world of the not-too-distant but still distant future, one of the most common ways for basic underworld messages to be passed from point A to point B are handwritten letters by couriers, because the only way to intercept that is to actually intercept the courier. You cannot digitally sniff it out. You cannot overhear it by surveillance.
And you have to intercept the courier while they have the message.
Yep.
Because if you've got a courier who is trustworthy enough to not read the letter, then the courier won't know what was in it.
This ties in very nicely to part 2 of what I was going to talk about, and that is the thing that is often bandied about in IT security, but also in human intelligence and other things right now, the concept of security through obscurity. If they have too much data to sift through, and what you are doing does not immediately look overtly suspicious or noteworthy, it is probably going to be filed away and completely forgotten.
If what you are doing can be made to look like a normal conversation in a cafe, there are thousands of normal conversations going on in hundreds of cafes all over Nuevo Paradiso, and nobody's going to care.
And if you are not personally a person of immediate interests, or even if you are not immediate interest enough to literally zoom in and listen to everything you say,
just keep really, really hot button keywords out of the conversation.
And you'll be fine. And even then, keep some of it low volume, but not whispering. If you whisper too much, that will also trip sensors because, whispering is suspicious.
Say anything hot button in a past note.
Pretty much.
Or use keyword, or use, code words for it.
Similarly,
you can arrange that with people.
If you're a courier, one of the most commonly used methods is to simply employ actual couriers who happen to be going the places you want to go, and slipping the letters into packages. No problem. No need to intercept that. Not going to raise any flags. There are further methods of avoiding surveillance, but even in a pervasive state, honestly, if you're not going out and stirring too much trouble, these will work. There's a reason that I picked these. I think Ian is probably going to concur with this, but one of the reasons that I picked the fact of the pervasive surveillance and the fact that you can't just walk around with radiating EMP knocking it out is because we don't want every single game to immediately devolve into a post-apocalyptic cyberpunk gunfest. This is not a game where the answer to every problem is I have a hip-mounted assault cannon. Fun as those power trips are, that's not what we're going for.
Nor is this a game where you are actually trying to fight against the pervasive system. This is a game where you exist within the pervasive system, and so do your problems.
Yep.
And so you and they both got to deal with it.
Other sides of the setting, again, the aforementioned China, some areas of the United States, certain parts of the European Union, etc., former Soviet blocs, these are different stories. But we're not telling that story right now.
So, speaking of stories, let's move into the topic which is going to take even more words to talk about, because this is a broad topic. And we're going to start with the specific thing about setting up the story of how does it start?
Right.
Where is the seed for a Downbelow story? And the general seed for a Downbelow story is you are a person, and all of the other PCs are people who, because you are people who are out of place, you can't get everything you need easily, and a situation comes up that does one of two things. It either threatens to take away what little you have, or it gives you an opportunity to grab for that gold ring.
So, really very quickly, about characters. Sometimes you can't get what you need because you're out of place. This would be the expatriate who, for some strange reason, their return visa was denied. They're stuck out there, and no one will convert their credits into local currency. And because they're out of place, they can't get it. It could be the multiply wanted criminal who cannot legitimately connect to any of the social databases to withdraw their funds because they'll be arrested. Alternately, sometimes you're out of place because you can't get what you want or need. This could be the war veteran who lost his leg and does not want to wait the 18 months for a replacement bare-bones prosthesis and would like to be walking now.
The war veteran who is psychologically damaged and needs a battle, but there aren't any for him right now.
This could be the thrill-seeking corporate kid who wants to do something that isn't boring and so falls out that way. Or it could be any number of people for any number of reasons. So it doesn't always follow the same thing. The point I'm trying to make is origins are incredibly wide and incredibly varied and probably a topic for another time, but I felt that it needed to be addressed right now.
Right. But where that origins do relate to starting a story because you're going to have to build in whatever origins a character does have. But getting back to those two story seeds, let me give a couple of examples. So, you've got one of the classic action slash crime movie setups of your brother, sister, or significant other has been kidnapped. That is an example of they're taking away what little you have.
Yep.
Similar plot setup is you've got a debt and the gang boss that you owe wants to collect. And so you gotta do something. This is often a heist movie setup as well as an action movie setup. You gotta do something extreme to be able to make good on your debt to the crime lord.
Something longer term. The place where you and your friends and family have been living happens to be somewhere that you had thought was a corporate abandoned warehouse. Turns out it's not actually abandoned and forgotten, and they want to renovate that, and they need you out of there. Whether they're going to address it peacefully or by force, you need to find somewhere else to live because they're taking away your home. And they have every right to. That's the important part. Mm-hmm. They have every right to. They're not the bad guys here. Arguably, you're the bad guys here, but you're just trying to live.
And this is a story because you're not just presented with, and some goons oust you. This becomes a story because, for going in backwards from our examples, because, because there's a but.
Yeah.
For the warehouse it might be, but you might be able to score a new place, but you might be able to slip something in under the table and you don't need the whole warehouse, just this little part you're living in.
Etc.
Or it might, something else.
Or it might even be, some goons are about to oust you. What do you do next?
But the point is that it becomes a story because the GM will have something in mind so that when that scene is over and you've either fought off the goons but now you know that they're going to be pushing you out by force one way or another, or you've run away or whatever, there is a next thing in mind that continues that plot.
That's actually possibly the most important question to ask when starting a story. What is this story about? What is the story that we are going to tell together about?
And in the case of the someone got kidnapped, then there's the, who did it and why? In the case of the you owe a debt, what is the opportunity that you have to pay back that debt? Is it being presented to you by the person you owe, or is it something that you find through some other means, or it's something that you have to find? That's the challenge. You have to find a way. And then there's the other kind of seed that I mentioned. Rather than the taking away the little you have, there's the you have that chance. So this is also a pretty common heist movie setup. It's also the setup for a movie that was much better than it had any right to be with its stupid setup, the Burn After Reading.
Mm-hmm.
So close to walking out of the theater so many times, but so glad I stayed.
Yeah. It way better crafted than than it deserved. I ended up. Really
it was terrible and fun.
Anyway,
and it's a great example of the kind of story that can happen in Downbelow because these nobodies happen upon what they think is a highly classified and therefore valuable thing. It's not. They're dumb. This is where failure creates stories.
Yep.
And therefore, hilarity ensues.
Hilarity and a bloodbath, but
a hilarious bloodbath.
But
oh god,
impressively,
get rid of.
Impressively, it is not a valiant opera of bullets. It just happens to be a professional intelligence cleaning crew going through and eliminating loose ends that aren't actually loose ends, but they could be. And
there's a couple of different things.
And then there's...
But
that's neither here nor there.
And then there's some professional cleaning.
Because we're not doing a review of the movie. So we talked about
another good movie example of you've got an opportunity... Oh, what was the one I had in mind? Speed Racer.
Yep.
You've
Which
got
also
an
is
opportunity
much better than it has
to
been
grab
to
at
be.
that golden ring. Not exactly in genre for Downbelow, although not too far outside of it.
Yeah.
And it's a little too over the top.
Well, let's face it, the racing circuit plot, if we transplant that to VR and translate the physical ability to simple reflexes and
if you translate it to VR, or if you make the racing maneuvers a little bit less extreme, no flipping cars to punch people in midair.
There is an active, mostly sponsored by the Yakuza and Triads, there is an active drift racing circuit even on Nuevo Paradiso itself. It mostly happens largely off camera in deserted areas, but it does happen. Excuse me, it does happen.
Mm-hmm. So you can do those things. They've even got segments of the underground roadways that they arrange with their contacts to just not really have those cameras paid attention to for certain periods of time because they have blocked them off from normal traffic because they're not used that often, and so they do their races.
But bringing us back to seeds and branches. Once you've got your seed, once you've figured out what is this story about, where does it go from there? How do you build the branches?
And from there, you need to build it maybe scene by scene or maybe motivation by motivation. The motivations are things like those seeds of, if they grab that ring, what then? What's the next threat? What are they going to have to do to keep hold of that ring? If they keep hold of the thing that was threatened, what's the next threat or opportunity that logically follows in this story? And if you decide on a thread that connects all of these things, it makes it easier. That's the overarching, what is this story about?
My personal preferred method to construct a Downbelow story, or a story like a Downbelow story, is to focus mainly on two things. I do not focus at all on plot. I don't focus at all on story. The plot and the story. The plot is, what do the players do? What do the players involve themselves in? I don't start off by saying, here is a plot I'd like to happen. That's not really a good way to do an interactive story. I should go write my own book.
Plot and narrative are products of the experience.
On the other hand, what I do prepare, and what I put most of my work into, is a combination of players, and by players I mostly mean characters and factions that are involved with the story, and agendas. When I have a list of players and a list of agendas and a list of motivations and methods, it's actually very easy to figure out, based on where we are right now, what's about to happen. From there I can filter it down and say, and we'll probably need stats for a firefight in an abandoned warehouse, so I should have some stuff ready and have a vague idea of how difficult it will be and what the scene will be so that I'll know what to go back and forth with when they're ambushed by it, or how difficult it will be to spot the ambush. But the important part is I'm not planning for the players to have a climactic firefight in the warehouse. I just think it's likely because they're dealing with smugglers and corporate security. They're investigating on behalf of the one and in conflict with the other. Which is the one, which is the other? You decide. It could work either way. And
maybe the players decide. Maybe the story could end up with them on either side, depending.
And the interesting thing is, the other thing that I do is always have an idea of, if the players don't interfere, if the players choose to sit back and do nothing, here's where it will end up. I do not leave that up to randomness. Do not leave that up to chance. As the storyteller, you hold all the cards. If the players don't involve themselves, there's no need to sit back, wonder, and or in classic RPG style, roll dice to see who wins. Decide who wins. Let the actions of the players be the thing that helps decide that. In using the original D&D as an example, if you have set up a war between a lawful empire, a chaotic empire, and an evil cult infiltrating all three, and the players choose not to involve themselves...
Yes, all three. The cult is also infiltrating themselves.
Sure, why not? And the players choose not to involve themselves. The players would rather just go dungeon delving. You don't have to sit there rolling dice in the middle of the session to decide which faction wins.
You can decide that eventually the lawful kingdom will win their war, but the evil cult will have infiltrated both to such an extent that that will become the main controlling faction.
If the story of the game world is that war, and the players decide that they couldn't care less about the war and they'd rather just go dungeon delving, and you're all having fun, roll with it. If you want to drag them back into that story, throw them hooks whenever they arrive back in town, throw them prophecies in the dungeon, but let them do what they choose to do. If they come out of the dungeon and find out that the town that they've using as a home base has been taken over by the evil empire and is also being used as a farm for just human sacrifices, and they want to take action about that, that's great. Because you haven't forced them into anything. And if they decide to say, oh, well, that's new, let's go back to the dungeon, that's also great, because they're doing it. I guess
human flesh is now available at the market.
Yeah.
Butchered. Well, we didn't want to buy any, so we'll just buy our magic items.
Right.
Those are still available.
Because, and
10% chance some of them are cursed.
Can
we pay extra to get rid of that?
So the same principle applies here. If you have a sense of the factions at play in your world, if you have a sense of the factions at play more specifically in your story, the agendas those factions are going for, and in general, what will happen if the PCs do not involve themselves, and they never have to involve themselves, and you are free to make it as unpleasant as possible if you really want them to involve themselves, and show them by actual repercussions what happens when they don't involve themselves. You will never have to worry about what happens. You don't even have to have a plot in mind. It will make itself.
So yeah, to recap, plan out who cares about what and what they'll do if the PCs don't stop them from doing it. And what they'll do if the PCs get involved to help with whatever. Plot that out for multiple involved personalities. Whether that be the FBI, the CIA, and the other three-letter agencies. Whether that be Yggdrasil Corporate Security, Yggdrasil Marketing, and the cabaret down the street. Whoever. Decide on the major personalities and locations and just the major players in your story and what they're going to do and what they want. And then decide on some scenes that are likely and make up stats for those scenes appropriate to what you think is probably going to happen, and be ready to adjust that based on how the player actions will change that. We'll talk more about statting out scenes and deciding how a scene should run in the system next time, and we will also talk about we will also talk about player origins and character origins in the setting next time. Those are two of the things we'll touch on.
I was actually thinking about something different for the next 2 weeks. I was thinking we'd take some time and actually design the basics of some factions on screen. We'll design one, and one next week, and we'll design another the week after, and talk about how they relate to each other. So we're not entirely sure of our agenda, but we're going to do one or more of these three things next time.
We'll do both those things. Next week we will talk about PC origins, and we will talk about scene plotting, and we will design one of the canon factions.
There we go. Which faction shall we design next time?
Let's go with the local Yakuza family.
There we go.
Because that's a good start.
So next time, gangsters. Flashy cars, tattoos, and missing fingers.
Also Yakuza.
Yes.
Because the last part was the PCs.
Probably.
Good night.